Welcome to the Project Management Prepcast, helping you prepare for the PMP exam. Here's your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner.
Hello and welcome back to the PM Prepcast, where we help you understand and not just memorize the PMBOK guide. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner, and in this lesson we are reviewing the Identify Risks process. Identify Risks is an iterative process, a continuous process that involves the project team, management, stakeholders and subject matter experts. The goal is to identify risks that may impact the project, document their characteristics, and, if possible, already begin planning a response. As part of our review, we will discuss initiating the project of risk identification. We'll look at inputs that we will be using to identify risks in our projects, like plans, baselines, and estimates, and we'll look at our tools and techniques such as document reviews, information gathering techniques, several analyses and diagramming techniques, and the output of the Identify Risk process, which is the risk register. The lesson is divided up into two parts. In the first part, we'll provide an overview of the Identify Risks process, introduce and discuss the main concept and important aspects of the process, look at the inputs and their importance, and begin discussing the tools and techniques. And then in the second part, we'll finish up the discussion of the tools and techniques, introduce and discuss our single output, the risk register, and also do a quick review. We begin with the definition of the project risk management knowledge area. So, project risk management includes the processes of conducting risk management planning, identification, analysis, response planning, and controlling risk on a project. And here in risk management specifically, this definition translates nicely into the processes. And the project risk management knowledge area has a total of 6 processes, and it all begins with plan risk management, which is the process of defining how to conduct risk management activities for a project. And once you know how you're going to do this, you will be moving on to identify risks, which is the focus of our lesson right here. It's the process of determining which risks may affect the project and documenting their characteristics. So the big difference here between plan risk management and identified risks is simply that in plan risk management, we were only doing planning. How are we going to approach this? And now here in this process, we're actually taking the first step. What are our risks? We're trying to identify them. From there, we move on to perform qualitative risk analysis, the process of prioritizing risks for further analysis or action by assessing and combining their probability of occurrence and impact. Those risks that have the highest probability and impact assigned to them will then be moved on to the perform quantitative risk analysis process, which is the process of numerically analyzing the effect of identified risks on overall project objectives. Now we can go ahead and plan risk responses. This is the process of developing options and actions to enhance opportunities, to reduce threats to project objectives. And finally, we need to control our risks in the process of implementing risk response plans, tracking identified risks, monitoring residual risks, identifying new risks, and evaluating risk process effectiveness throughout the project. Almost all processes in this knowledge area fall into the planning process group. We started out with plan risk management, obviously in the planning process group, and we have now moved on to the focus of this lesson, which is identify risks, and we're staying in the planning process group as well. The main concept that you have to understand in Identify Risks is that this is an iterative and continuous process throughout the entire project. You cannot just identify your risks and then start on your project work, managing only those risks until the project is done. Instead, you will have to come back and execute this process at regular intervals. And this interval, by the way, will be documented in the risk management plan. We do this because as your project progresses, the project environment will change. As it changes, new risks may evolve or become known that may, if you do not identify them, impact your project. Once again, the Identify Risks process is all about identifying project risks which may impact the project and documenting their characteristics. But who are the individuals that should participate in risk identification? Well, here is a list that you can use as a start. And of course, it all starts with you, with the project manager. From there, we go out to the project management team that you managed, to project team members. Maybe your organization has a risk management team whom you can involve. There are customers and end users. And let's not forget the company's subject matter experts. Maybe your customers also have subject matter experts that they rely on. Subject matter experts know the business, so they are an excellent group to help identify any risks. Our project stakeholders, who may not be part of the day-to-day project team, but who certainly will be able to contribute to this exercise of identifying risks. You can also reach out to trade organizations and bring in industry representatives. And if that doesn't work out, there are always consultants who do this kind of work. Another good choice are our fellow project managers, people who have managed similar projects before and likely have a wealth of experience. And of course, in the end, there are also people who do this kind of thing for a living, and they are called risk management experts. In identifying the risks on your project, you should engage a large and diverse group in the process. And that's simply because when it comes to identifying your project risk, the rule is simply the more stakeholders that you have involved in risk identification, the more risks will you identify. Okay. Having more and more and more risks means you're going to have to sift through them, look through them, and ensure that they really are valid and that they really are posing impact to the project if they happen to really become an issue on your project. But wouldn't you much rather have that situation of having to go through that task rather than missing a risk that could severely impact your project simply because you didn't have adequate participation? Just as you did during planning of risk management, it is now vital that you obtain commitment for continuing risk identification activities as well as ownership of these tasks. As the project manager, you'll need to use your management skills to develop within the team this sense of shared responsibility and shared ownership. This is as important as initially identifying risks, because once you have hundreds of risks on your list, going forward, you surely cannot monitor them all alone. So, your team must help to identify new risks as the conditions of the project change and promptly communicate them to everybody and to you. Define and describe the conditions, current and future, that could give rise to additional risks. Formulate responses and actions that will help mitigate or eliminate risks. And part of being responsible and taking ownership is to monitor any and all conditions or changes that may introduce risks to the project. Let's review our ITTOs, our inputs, tools and techniques and outputs for the Identify Risks process with our usual overview here with the figure from the PMBOK guide. And one thing that's immediately obvious is the sheer number of inputs and tools and techniques used in this process. And then we only have one single output, the risk register. And given the number of inputs and what we do with this information, the risk register must be a very important document indeed. The failure of many projects can be traced back to a poorly created, maintained or executed risk register. Okay, so this is a heavy process, heavy in regards to the inputs. In particular, the Identify Risk process has the following 13 inputs, and they are the Risk Management Plan, obviously, the Cost Management Plan, the Schedule Management Plan, the Quality Management Plan, the Human Resource Plan, the Scope Baseline, the Activity Cost Estimates, and the Activity Duration Estimates. But those aren't all, because we couldn't squeeze all 13 onto one slide. So moving right along, we also have the Stakeholder Register, various project documents, the procurement documents, the enterprise environmental factors, our organizational process assets, and finally the kitchen sink. Well, no, just added that to make sure that you were still paying attention here. And when you look at this list, you're going to think, my God, we're pretty much using the whole project environment as inputs to this process. And you're absolutely right. That's pretty much the case here. You will see many of these inputs again and again throughout the risk management processes. But it's of course most useful to learn why we need them as inputs to this process, rather than just memorizing the list of 13 items here. One way to approach the question of why we have the inputs we do, especially when we have so many, is to group them into types. So let's take a look at these types of inputs, beginning with the management plans, of which there are 5. They all contain some aspect of risk. So you'll need to review the risk, cost, schedule, quality, and human resources management plans, and identify project risk in each document. For example, the risk management plan contains risk categories, roles and responsibilities, and the budget and schedule of the risk management activities. The other plans contain processes, controls, objectives, expectations, assumptions, constraints, and dependencies, which all contain elements of project risk. The scope baseline, a subsidiary component of the project management plan, is specifically listed as one of our inputs. Assumptions contained in the project scope statement, an element of the scope baseline, are often sources of uncertainty, hence risk. The WBS, the work breakdown structure, again another component of the scope baseline, can be used to recognize and categorize risk at different levels of the WBS hierarchy. And estimates, such as activity cost and activity duration, by their very nature are a source of uncertainty. They should be critically evaluated to identify the potential risk inherent in this uncertainty. Moving on to organizational process assets. They should be utilized throughout the project lifecycle. For instance, using a risk register from a similar type of project might be useful for identifying similar risks on your project. Project process controls are put in place to minimize inherent risk and modified to reduce residual risks. In addition, lessons learned documentation, experience from other project managers, and risk management experts all may contribute to identifying risks, and they're all organizational process assets. And then we have environmental factors, both internal and external to the organization, that influence the project. They must be considered in the risk identification process. These might include academic or industry studies, published information relevant to the project, benchmarks that you can use to assess the validity of your estimates, and of course the organization's risk attitudes and risk tolerances. And finally, project documents. Like the stakeholder register lists project supporters and opponents who could be a source of risk. Procurement documents can be a source of risk if they contain ambiguous language or do not address contingencies or penalties for lack of performance. Other documents, such as the project charter, project schedule, issue log, and quality checklists, all contain elements of risks. Yes, there are a lot of inputs, and how best to use all of this information is the subject of our next slide, our tools and techniques. The Identify Risk process is about locating sources of risk on our project, documenting where this risk exists and its characteristics. As we have just discussed, there are a mountain of inputs to consider in order to adequately identify and evaluate project risk. And fortunately, we also have a substantial number of tools and techniques that will help assist us in this process. And these tools and techniques are documentation reviews, which we will execute according to a consistent and specific methodology. We have information gathering techniques designed to expose risk and its cause. There's checklist and assumptions analysis that consider both historical and current project information. Several diagramming techniques that, like our analysis techniques, are used to identify both risks and causation. And we have the SWOT analysis to highlight areas of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And as always, we will rely on our experts, both internal and external, throughout the process. So much for our high-level overview of the 6 tools and techniques. Let's now jump into a detailed review for each, beginning with the documentation review, because the vast majority of our inputs are all documents, historical and current, internal and external. So we define documentation review as a structured review of project documentation, including management plans, scope documents, estimates, organizational process assets, enterprise environmental factors, previous and current project files, and agreements. And by structured, we mean that we review the documents in a specific way, looking for features or aspects that may expose project risk. The next slide describes this approach. We perform document review with 2 very specific goals in mind. Goal number 1 is to clearly understand the content of our documents from a complete project perspective. Closely reviewing the documentation provides a clear picture of the project objectives, such as scope, cost, time, and quality, and questioning the assumptions, constraints, and dependencies that underlie these project objectives, which may have changed from when they were drafted, will expose potential risk. Then our second goal is to assess the quality of the documents. How well are they written? Are they complete? Are they broadly framed? Are they detailed? Are there any major inconsistencies or gaps between these documents? An exceptionally well-documented schedule is great, but if the budget isn't as well documented, it will serve as a source of risk. Okay, so now that you have read all your inputs, examined all your documents, are you exhausted yet? Well, then do take a break and get yourself a cup of tea, because you need to be fresh for the next exercises, which can all improve your chances of identifying project risk. But that's going to be in part 2. Now we have reached the end of part 1 of this lesson, so it's time for Justine to say,
We only part to meet again.
and of course I say, until next time.